Alright, it's time for our annual mobile phone mega review again. Have you been looking forward to this for a long time? Many of you probably still remember our mega review from early last year. The flagship phones from every brand, from the standard models to the ultra models, were all completely exposed by us. So this year, we've decided to turn it up a notch. For this generation, we're not just including all the various flagships, but also sub-flagships and mid-range phones. We've included them all. The entire mega review will be split into 4 episodes. Gaming performance, battery life, cameras, and system smoothness. Our standards will be even more rigorous than last year. Not only have we introduced more methods to uncover the various tricks used by phone manufacturers, but we will also introduce more dimensions to evaluate this generation of phones more comprehensively. To be honest, the workload is explosive. So I hope everyone can show their support. Give us a like, leave a comment, and share. It's not too much to ask, right? So today, let's first talk about a common topic. That happens to be the worst hit area for manufacturer cheating, which is gaming performance. As everyone knows, before a new phone hits the market, manufacturers send us media units for review. Among them are many hands-on experiences, which are essentially sponsored videos. Now, these media units are very subtle. Many manufacturers like to pull some little tricks on these media units. First, they cherry-pick the chip quality, selecting those with good quality and low power consumption. Then, they push targeted scheduling policies specifically for the media's testing process. Special binning plus special tuning. Anyway, before the machine goes on sale, we can't buy retail units to verify it. As long as you want to catch that first wave of launch traffic, you have to obediently swallow your pride. Actually, in last year's mega review, we brought this up to call out the major manufacturers. At that time, to avoid controversy, we just referred to them as Model A and Model B. I originally thought everyone would exercise a bit more restraint, but I didn't expect that the new phones from last year not only failed to restrain themselves, but instead went further and further down the path of cheating, becoming even more excessive. A major reason is that this generation of the 8x10 to the power of 5 and 9500 chips are incremental upgrades. If they didn't mess with the media units, it would be very hard to widen the gap with the previous generation's 8E and 9400. Consumers this year actually completely distrust the data from launch day media units. Some data looks fake at first glance. Everyone defaults to assuming it's all fake. I feel that if we don't completely clarify this issue of special media unit tuning, these manufacturers will only become more unscrupulous this year. This only affects our own credibility. So for this year's mega review, we're not even going to try to avoid controversy. We'll directly display which manufacturer and which model, and do a naked comparison of how much difference there is between the media units sent for testing and the retail units sold to consumers. Come on, let's reveal the answer. First, there are a very few manufacturers with no special tuning at all. That's the Apple iPhone. In fact, because iOS 26.1 and 26.2 are being continuously optimized, if you look at its frame rate and power consumption, the newly tested retail units generally perform even better than the media units sent back then. Of course, you could also say that the launch of iOS 26.0 was too terrible, but either way, Apple is indeed relatively honest. As for the major Android manufacturers in the test, almost all of them failed. Since everyone tested at different resolutions during launch, let's not do a cross-brand comparison of different manufacturers here yet. We will compare them uniformly later. But what I want to say is that, without exception, everyone is cheating with special tuning. No one is innocent. For example, the Find X9 series equipped with the Dimensity 9500. On the media units, Honkai, StarRail could run at full frame rate under 900p plus resolution. The retail unit simply can't reach full frames. It drops to just over 50 FPS. Next door, Vivo wasn't much better. Even though the retail unit can approach full frames at 700p plus, its power consumption is 1.3 W higher than the media unit. For a 5 W plus machine, a power consumption increase of 1.3 W. You can imagine how ridiculous the special media unit binning is. On the Qualcomm side, for brands like OnePlus, it depends on the model. With the 8x10 to the power of 5 OnePlus 15, the media unit ran at full frames for the entire 30 minutes. The retail unit could only last 15 minutes. This is already considered a relatively small degree of special tuning because it was the first to launch. It lacked a reference point for special tuning. As for subsequent sub-flagships like the A6 and A6T, obvious special media unit tuning exists for all of them. Actually, for the A6T, we waited until after it hit the market to retest it with a retail unit before making the review. If you compare the power consumption, you'll know how aggressive the tuning was. The special tuning for the iQOO 15 is even more extreme than for OnePlus. Not only is the frame rate identical to the OnePlus 15, where it can only maintain full frames for 15 minutes before throttling, but the power consumption is also much higher than the media unit. The situation with Xiaomi is more complicated. For the 3 machines in the 17 series, the VRS, variable rate shading, on the launch day media units was forced on and couldn't be turned off. They saved performance by sacrificing image quality. We already warned everyone about this in our Xiaomi 17 series launch video. After the launch, VRS could finally be turned off, but these retail units tested noticeably worse than the media units at the time. Performance scheduling is a step behind, and power consumption is also a step higher. Redmi's K90 Pro Max is one of the few machines with a small degree of cheating. but the standard K90 and Turbo 5 Max both have very aggressive special tuning. The retail performance is significantly worse. On Honor's side, the Magic 8 Pro's retail unit not only has a lower frame rate, but power consumption is also 1W higher. It runs much hotter. The Honor Win everyone's been dreaming of isn't clean either. Although the retail unit still has strong frame stability, its power consumption reached over 8W, skyrocketing by 1.7W. This heat led to the frame rate not being able to stay maxed out like on the media unit. In the second half, because of the heat, the phantom frame stability mode deactivated. So if you look at its 1% low frames, they are far from being as good as those of the media unit. As for Nubia and Red Magic, they are old repeat offenders. Although retail performance is powerful, power consumption is inevitably much higher. Cases like these, where media unit frame rates are similar but power consumption is significantly lower, are quite common. Finally, looking at the actual chassis temperature, you can see the gap in these measurements is massive. A viewer sees your launch day review and thinks, wow, this temperature is acceptable. Then they buy it, play it, and go, wow, it's like an explosion of heat. It's nothing like what was in the review. This kind of thing is far too common. Besides that, some of you have also noticed that many machines released later have more severe special tuning than those released earlier. This leads to a discussion of why manufacturers choose to specially tune media units internally. For example, if manufacturer A debuts a flagship platform, after we test A and the results come out, the leadership at manufacturer B sees our results for A and will make this demand of their own engineers. The performance of the machines you tune must test better than manufacturer A's. We won't accept results worse than manufacturer A's. The leaders themselves might not have intended to cheat. They just have too much confidence in their own team, feeling there's no reason their own strength shouldn't beat everyone else's. So they set it up like that. But no matter how strong an engineering team is, they still have to follow the laws of physics using the same chip. Unless A's tuning is terrible, how on earth could B possibly beat A? In the end, if engineers can't meet the leadership's KPIs without cheating, they naturally have to resort to dishonest methods. Then manufacturer leadership sees this and goes, hey, why is manufacturer B so strong? If they can do it, why can't we? What we make must crush B. Manufacturer sees engineers are helpless. Since they cheated, I also have to cheat to catch up. So it might start as slight special tuning, but manufacturers that launch later are never willing to lag behind those that launch earlier. So the degree of cheating keeps snowballing, to the point where it looks fake at first glance. So today, I'm using this episode as an opportunity to hopefully bring attention to the issue of media unit cheating. It's also an appeal to major phone manufacturers to tune seriously and spend less energy on this kind of nonsense. When we eventually find out, you just embarrass yourselves. It's really unnecessary. However, there is bad news and good news. The good news is that this generation of flagship phones has basically eliminated the issue of significant brightness fluctuations in high-pressure games. Even the latest generation of iPhone didn't drop its brightness much in our testing, or at least, in our 300 nit testing environment. No brand dropped to a level that we could perceive. It seems this little trick has basically been phased out. So, back to the business at hand. Among the mobile phones of the past year, which brand has the strongest gaming performance? Which one has the best power efficiency and thermal control? Let's start with a newly released game that hasn't made it into any brand's whitelist yet. It's Arknight's Enfield. We did a special video on Enfield a while back. We actually had a deep technical exchange with the folks at Hypergriff and got a lot of useful info. For instance, its thread design favors CPUs with dual ultra-large cores, etc. Those who haven't seen that episode can go check it out first. This mega review uses the Ultra preset plus Ultra rendering multiplier. At 1036p resolution, the test route is the one with the highest CPU pressure in the whole game. Wooling City cable car run. Now, let's reveal the results. Unsurprisingly, the model with the best overall power efficiency in Arknight's Enfield is the iPhone 17 Pro Max. Not only did it maintain full frames throughout without any frame drops, but its power consumption was kept at an ultra-low 5.1W for the whole device, far lower than major Android models. Combining the 1% low frames and our subjective experience, the gaming experience on the iPhone 17 Pro Max is truly silky smooth, with almost no stuttering. In contrast, the scheduling on the iPhone 17 Pro is much more timid than the Pro Max, although its heat dissipation is also good. The strategy is very conservative. After running for over 10 minutes, it throttled due to temperature. The device power consumption was only 4.9W. Instead, the standard iPhone 17 with the A19 actually performed a bit better. An average of 56 frames is also very smooth. On the Android side, models with better performance include the iQOO 15 Brothers, OnePlus 15, the Nubia/Red Magic Brothers, and 8 times 10 to the power of 5 flagships like Honor Win and Magic 8 series. iQOO 15 only showed slight frame fluctuations after 20 minutes, maintaining an average frame rate of 58. All cores were kept around 1.6 GHz on average, resulting in final power consumption being controlled at 6.4W, which is quite good. Though the iQOO 15 Ultra is ridiculously priced, it is one of the few Android models to actually achieve full frames throughout. OnePlus 15 performed similarly to iQOO 15, even running the CPU at about 1.6 GHz, so the frame rates are about the same, and power consumption is similar too. Red Magic and Nubia's approach is also quite clever, even in awakening mode. they won't truly run at full tilt. So they reached an average of 57 frames with various small fluctuations, but at least they controlled the power consumption. The heat is still reasonable. Honor Magic 8 series is also tuned quite well. Honor Win's power consumption is a bit high. Both could maintain frame rates around 56 to 57. But what surprised me most were Honor's two 8E models, GT Pro and Win RT. These two using 8E can also reach very high frame rates. Even Win RT's efficiency is barely different from its 8 times 10 to the power of 5 big brother Win. Now you see how small the gap between 8E and 8 times 10 to the power of 5 is. Then, there are some machines that reach high frames, but haven't optimized power consumption well. Foremost is Redmi K90 Pro Max. 56.4 average frames looks okay, but the scheduling is baffling. The CPU rushes straight for 3 GHz. Power skyrocketed towards 10W in the first 10 minutes. Naturally, it couldn't hold and throttle later, averaging 8.2W throughout. Essentially untuned. Just raw power. Xiaomi's own 417 series phones aren't looking good either. Xiaomi 17 Pro Max was very aggressive at first too, but its cooling isn't as good as K90 Pro Max, so it throttled very quickly. Efficiency isn't great, and the temperature exploded, rushing all the way towards 50 degrees. The two standard models had similar frame rates and efficiency, running recklessly at first, then throttling frantically. Not counting Samsung, which hasn't launched yet. These are bottom-tier performers for 8 times 10 to the power of 5 devices. Actually, many 8E machines are as good as 8 times 10 to the power of 5. In addition to the Honor mentioned earlier, iQOO Neo 11, OnePlus Ace 5 Pro, Xiaomi 15 Ultra, Find X8 Ultra, all can exceed 50 frames. With low power consumption, other 8E models generally reach around 40 plus frames. Check your interested model to see where it stands. Next, let's talk about Dimensity models. As we've mentioned before, Enfield is not very favorable to MediaTek's single ultra-large core flagships. Unsurprisingly, the 9500 models are indeed not great. Although the frame rates of the X9 and X300 series aren't low, the power consumption is much higher than that of the Qualcomm camp, all reaching over 7W. The power efficiency is a disaster, and the temperature is impressive. Even more absurd are the iQOO Z10 Turbo Plus and the Redmi K80 Extreme Edition equipped with Dimensity 9400 Plus. The iQOO is too aggressive, and for the Redmi, the game isn't on the whitelist, it hasn't been tuned at all, so the power consumption just exploded. Finally, we also tested several new 8 Gen 5 machines. To be honest, the power efficiency of the 8 Gen 5 in Enfield is definitely inferior to the 8E. The power consumption of these machines skyrocketed to over 7 watts, yet the frame rate was only in the 40s. It doesn't seem to be doing very well. It should be said that the 8 Gen 5's pitifully small cache is a terrible fit for this kind of map streaming I/O pressure scenario. When moving at high speed, a large amount of assets pour into the cache, which is a real killer for the 8 Gen 5. Finally, from strongest to weakest, we'll show you the full results of these flagships and sub-flagships in Enfield. Does it match your expectations? As Enfield is a new game, I think including it in the mega review caught some manufacturers off guard. These Android manufacturers now rely heavily on whitelist mechanisms, and we're testing a popular game here. If you were playing a game outside the whitelist, you really shouldn't expect any good performance from these brands. Next, we'll test a mobile masterpiece that is definitely on the whitelist. It's Wuthering Waves. The quality of Wuthering Waves version 3.1 is good, and many people have returned to the game. Unfortunately, the load of this game is still quite high. We've updated the testing route this time, riding a motorcycle along this loop in Lahilo, sprinting through the map the whole time. This will also involve a large amount of asset streaming, which is quite difficult for open-world games to handle. On the Android side, we uniformly set it to the highest 864p resolution, with all settings maxed out. However, Wuthering Waves on iOS limits the maximum resolution to only 718p, so you have to be careful when doing cross-platform comparisons. But even with a lower resolution than Android, the power efficiency of Wuthering Waves on iOS is still not as good as on Android. The iPhone 17 Pro Max couldn't maintain full frames the entire time, averaging 57.2 FPS. The 6.2 watts power consumption is a bit high compared to 8 times 10 to the power of 5 models at 864p. However, the iPhone actually reached 6W level power consumption in a game, which is rare. The 17 Pro Max's thermal release is indeed much more aggressive than previous iPhones. The other two more conservative iPhones, the 17 Pro and Standard 17, were not so comfortable. They only ran at 50 frames at 718p, which on the Android side is only about the same as some good 8 Gen 3 models. Wuthering Waves is developed based on Unreal Engine 4. After all, Epic and Apple are courtroom acquaintances, so the poor optimization on iOS is somewhat expected. Now, are there any machines that run Wuthering Waves particularly well? It seems to be those same familiar names. Among 8 times 10 to the power of 5 flagships, first are these two machines from Nubia and Red Magic. While reaching full frames without pressure, the power consumption was also controlled at 5.6 watts. This can be considered a very good balance. Honor's performance was also very good. Both the Magic 8 Pro and the Win could achieve full frames without pressure. Then there's iQOO. The iQOO 15 Ultra also achieved completely full frames. The iQOO 15 similarly achieved near full frames. and the power consumption was kept quite low. It's quite good among value flagships. Xiaomi flagship's performance in Wuthering Waves was not as disappointing as in Enfield. After all, they're on the whitelist. The Xiaomi 17 Pro Max and Redmi K90 Pro Max can both achieve near full frames, while power consumption stays at a reasonable level. However, the Xiaomi 17 Pro Max is limited by its rear screen. Its heat dissipation is indeed not very good. The Redmi K90 Pro Max's heat dissipation, on the other hand, is quite decent, with temperatures almost as low as the Red Magic. However, as everyone knows, the 8x10 to the power of 5 hasn't made much progress compared to the 8E. This is also vividly reflected in Wuthering Waves. In fact, many 8E machines run very well. Models like the Realme GT8, OnePlus A6, Honor Win RT, and iQOO Neo 11, as well as the X8 Ultra and X200 Ultra imaging flagships, can all reach close to 60 frames in Wuthering Waves. Meanwhile, MediaTek machines also performed quite well in Wuthering Waves. The Dimensity 9500 powered X9 and X300 series, despite not being as maxed out as some 8x10 to the power of 5 models, can also reach near full frames with relatively low power consumption. Even machines based on the 9400, like the Redmi Turbo 5 Max and OnePlus Ace 5 Extreme Edition, also have quite good performance. Where there are good ones, there are certainly some that are not so good. For example, the OnePlus 15. The media unit tested very smoothly back then. As it turns out, the retail unit playing Wuthering Waves starts to lock at 45 frames due to temperature control after 18 minutes. The experience is even worse than their own 80 model, the A6. The OnePlus Ace 5 Pro and 13T, also from OnePlus, both have similar frame locking strategies. The same goes for the sister brand Realme's GT8 Pro. It starts locking at 45 frames after 11 minutes of play, which is even worse than their own GT8. The performance of Xiaomi 17 Pro, 17 Ultra, and Standard 17, these 3 8x10 to the power of 5 flagships, is also not great. They throttle and drop frames as you play. Even more absurd is the Redmi K90. As an 8E model, it locks at 30 frames after only 7 minutes. Then it occasionally recovers to 60 FPS, only to jump back to 30 FPS. Just look at this frame rate curve. What on earth is this? There's no way this game can be smooth. To tell you the truth, compared with its own big brother, the K90 Pro Max, it's like they weren't even made by the same team. It's just too weak. We also tested the other 8E models. Anyway, you can see at a glance who's good and who's bad. Conversely, the 8 Gen 5 models didn't perform as poorly in Wuthering Waves as they did in Enfield. All 3 8 Gen 5 models can maintain an average frame rate of over 58 FPS, except for the A6T. The power consumption of the other two is also relatively controllable. Speaking only of Wuthering Waves, this performance of the 8 Gen 5 is actually not worse than that of the 8E models. And while the Xiaomi's Ring 01 went head-to-head with the 9500 in Enfield, its performance in Wuthering Waves is relatively poor. It throttles and drops frames after playing for a while. The average is less than 50 FPS. Finally, here is an overview of the results for Wuthering Waves. Check out the performance of the models you're interested in. Next is a regular guest on our show, Honkai Star Rail. The golden hour is still a peak of mobile gaming pressure. However, in HSR, on iOS and some 8E models, as well as all 8 Gen 5 machines, the resolution is limited to 700p+. These machines cannot participate in our 981p comparison, so we tested both rounds. Let's first look at the high-load test at 981p. Unsurprisingly, the two top machines in HSR are the Red Magic 11 Pro and the Honor Win. Red Magic doesn't have any fancy tricks here. It just precisely controls CPU performance to a level that is just enough. You see, the average frequency of the ultra-large core is 1.4 GHz, and for the mid-cores, it's just over 1.2 GHz, which is not high, because the pressure in HSR is very high. Running at this level already results in 7.6 W power consumption, but Red Magic can still handle it. At the same time, the frame rate can reach nearly full frames. This is obviously tuned specifically for the scenario. The key message is, a gaming phone must prioritize gaming. However, Red Magic's performance is not perfect. While the performance tuning is top tier, we encountered touch issues while testing HSR. The touch control on both the left and right sides of the 11 Pro screen completely failed. The only solution was to exit and restart the game. This generation of Red Magic switched to Synaptic's touchscreen solution. There may still be areas where the software optimization is inadequate. It looks like it still needs a bit more work. Honor's performance here was also very good. Even without the phantom frame stability mode, the Win could run at a completely full 60 FPS for the first 25 minutes. After 25 minutes, some small fluctuations appeared, but the throttling was also very slight. This segment also had 57 frames. The average over the entire 30 minutes was 59.3 FPS. The power consumption was 7.8 W. In terms of temperature, it was a bit pushing it, but it could be considered handled. Turning on Phantom doesn't actually help with this subsequent period of stable throttling. Its primary role is to improve the 1% low frames during the initial period of maxed out 60 FPS, so you don't get that feeling of occasional stuttering. This issue of micro-stuttering cannot be solved by other brands. Even if they supplement frames up to 120 FPS, the experience in this initial period is indeed very noticeable. The 1% low frames were almost maxed out at 60. Very smooth. However, the power consumption for HSR at 981p is too high, so as the heat rose later, it automatically exited Phantom mode. Overall, the Win's performance was still very good, but I want to say that Honor's Phantom frame stability is not a completely free technology. When we tested the retail unit this time, turning on Phantom introduced some latency. It's different from the frame interpolation latency we usually talk about. The latency from Phantom primarily comes from triple buffering. You can actually see, when dragging like this, Phantom occasionally feels unresponsive. It drags 0 to 2 frames more than normal. Because the prerequisite for Phantom's stable frame output is that there must be frames in its reservoir, so Honor increases the size of this reservoir through triple buffering so as not to be unable to provide a frame when needed. But this increases latency and decouples rendering from output. While it does eliminate micro-stuttering, the price is that it feels a bit mushy when you play. Additionally, there seems to be a bug with Phantom frame stability on the Magic 8 series. Turning it on is no problem, but it cannot be turned off normally. It turns off the frame stability, but it doesn't turn off triple buffering. It's like you're playing with Phantom off, but the latency is still there. The Win does not have this problem. Only the Magic 8 series does. I can only interpret it as a bug that needs fixing. A rather special machine is the iQOO 15 Ultra. Judging solely by the frame rates we measured, it runs very aggressively. The 1% low frames actually reached 59. It's just absurd. But when actually playing, it felt like something wasn't quite right. Although it was indeed very smooth, it certainly didn't reach the level of 59 low frames. If the low frames were 59, it should output frames at an almost constant 16.67 milliseconds. The feel should be very silky. But in fact, the feel is more like playing with vertical sync, VSync, turned off. Even though it's very responsive, the frame generation time is unstable. We decided to investigate further. After carefully examining the traces, we found the problem. Its compositor, surface flinger, and the game's rendering output seem to be completely disconnected. The compositor always refreshes the screen at a steady 60 Hz pace, but it doesn't wait for game frames at all. In other words, regardless of whether this game frame is ready, the compositor will refresh the screen every 16.67 milliseconds, so the testing software always reads a perfect 60 FPS straight line. But for the game, when there is no touch input, it doesn't even receive the vertical sync signal from the compositor. The update rhythm is completely disconnected from 60 Hz. The game is actually running at its own pace. Only when touch input occurs does the game receive the VSync signal again, and the update interval gradually realigns with 60 Hz. At the same time, iQOO will also briefly boost the GPU frequency to compress the rendering time to within 16.67 milliseconds, and then wait for the next vertical sync to continue rendering. Throughout the process, the compositor remains stable at 60 FPS, but the game's actual frame time is drifting. It feels like one frame is fast and the next is slow. Whether this feeling of not having vertical sync is good or not, perhaps it can reduce latency. But you only need to know one thing: the frame rate measured this way is simply not real. These kinds of clever tricks that testing tools can't catch will only become more common, so in the future, we will also gradually introduce visual-based algorithms to test games. In any case, while the priest climbs a foot, the devil climbs 10. There's always a way to catch you. Returning to our mega review, the 85-powered Nubia Z80 Ultra and the 80-powered Honor Win RT also ran HSR very aggressively. But both achieved this by sacrificing power consumption. With such absurd power consumption of 8-9W, the temperature completely exploded, especially the Nubia Z80 Ultra. Its awakening mode is even more aggressive than Red Magic's awakening mode. The temperature shot straight above 50 degrees. I'm tempted to call it well done mode. The K90 Pro Max's performance is quite worthy of praise. Indeed, this generation of Redmi flagships perform quite well in whitelist games. It can be considered the best among Xiaomi devices. The Realme GT8 Pro and iQOO 15 are a bit behind, but still quite good. Below that, various 8x10 to the power of 5, 80, 9500, and 9400 models are all in the same boat. Most machines hover above 50 frames, and power consumption exceeds 7W. This is the general level. Are there any particularly bad machines? Yes. For example, the OnePlus Ace 6, iQOO Neo 10 Pro Plus, OnePlus 13T, and Realme GT8, and the Redmi K90. This isn't the first time for this one. These several 8E machines, including the Xiaomi 15S Pro, none of them reached 50 frames in HSR at 981p. Next, let's lower the resolution to 763p and see how Apple and the sub-flagships fare. After returning to the Unity engine, the iPhone's power efficiency seems to have come back to life. At the same 700p plus resolution, the iPhone 17 Pro Max's power consumption at full frames was controlled at just over 5W. It's still quite a bit lower than the 8x10 to the power of 5 flagships. The frame rate was basically maxed out throughout. Performance is quite good. The frame rate fluctuations for the iPhone 17 and 17 Pro are larger, but they are still relatively smooth. At 700p plus resolution, basically most current 8x10 to the power of 5, 9500, 80, and even the 3.8 Gen 5 mid-range machines can run smoothly near full frames. But there are a few disappointing exceptions. For example, the standard Xiaomi 17. And again, the Redmi K90 gets a special mention. Both have very timid scheduling strategies. In this HSR test, we decided that at the 700p plus setting, which everyone can run, we would add a round of Devil's test data, 30-degree 5G environment. Based on our own 5G core network, Geekerwan Telecom, we successfully conducted the 5G gaming power consumption test for the first time. In this 30-degree 5G Devil's test, we can see if there are any differences in power consumption compared to a room temperature Wi-Fi environment. Sure enough, in the high temperature 5G environment, a large group of devices went down. Those who could persevere were the real heroes. On the iPhone side, the 17 Pro Max lived up to expectations. Under 30-degree 5G, it could still basically maintain near full frames. It didn't lose much performance compared to 25-degree Wi-Fi. The progress of this generation of iPhone in heat dissipation is obvious to all. The OnePlus 15 and A6, and even the 8 Gen 5 A6T, didn't show much frame dropping. This includes all iQOO models in the test, Honor Win and RT, Red Magic, and Nubia, as well as the Redmi K90 Pro Max, Turbo 5 Max, and K80 Extreme Edition. Also, the Find X8 Ultra and Realme Neo 8 also seemed relatively robust in the Devil's test. Then there were several Dimensity 9500 machines, the X9 and X300 series. Under 30-degree 5G, there was slight frame dropping, but they can be considered to have held on. The frame count wasn't too bad either. Of course, there were also machines heavily affected by the outdoor conditions, such as the iPhone 17 Pro with its very timid temperature control, and the entire Xiaomi 17 family. The Xiaomi 15S Pro, with Zring 1 plus external MediaTek baseband, 15 Ultra, and the Realme GT8 Pro, all were significantly affected in the 30-degree 5G environment, with severe frame dropping. In terms of power consumption, it actually surprised us. The power consumption in the 5G scenario was not much higher than on Wi-Fi. Although some models indeed had higher 5G power consumption, there were also machines where the power consumption difference between 5G and Wi-Fi was negligible. This was even with the 30-degree high-temperature debuff. From our experience, for 5G to be very power consuming, it must be in a low signal scenario or one with frequent cell switching or network searching. Unless it's a cloud game, gaming doesn't consume that much network bandwidth. In a laboratory test like ours, if we don't use very low signal strength, there might not be a significant gap in power consumption between 5G and Wi-Fi. Finally, we also tested Honor of Kings, which has relatively low pressure. Since the iPhone only supports 120 FPS high definition, we won't compare it with the Android machines at 120 FPS Ultra. Let's see how each Android flagship's power efficiency control performs. What we completely didn't expect was that the crown for the best Honor of Kings power efficiency was taken by the Dimensity 9500 models from Oppo and Vivo. The X9 series and X300 series both recorded the lowest overall device power consumption of around 3W, including the two 9400 machines, the OnePlus Ace 5 Extreme Edition and iQOO Z10 Turbo Plus. The power consumption was also very good. In comparison, for various 8x10 to the power of 5 flagships, their Honor of Kings power efficiency had no advantage over the 8E. This is also very reasonable. After all, this generation of Qualcomm's low-frequency efficiency has simply not improved. It's important to note that because Honor of Kings has a low load, the screen will account for a larger proportion of the total device power consumption. Please don't directly interpret the total power consumption as chip power consumption. The smoothness of Honor of Kings primarily refers to the performance of low frames. If you play Honor of Kings a lot, you can also look at the low frame measurements we took to make a choice. In addition to performance testing, touch control is also a very important part of gaming. Is the touch latency of this generation of flagship phones high when playing games? Are they responsive? We also tested click latency this time. First, as we did last year, we enabled the performance mode/game mode of each phone and tested the end-to-end latency in Peacekeeper Elite from the touch of firing to the flash from the muzzle on the screen. As we mentioned last year, because of the existence of vertical sync, end-to-end latency will not be a precise value. Sometimes it responds very quickly when pressed. Sometimes there might be a delay before it reacts. So our test must involve many rounds to get an average. And this time, we'll also measure a standard deviation to see if the range of latency fluctuations is stable. Let's look at Peacekeeper Elite first. Can you guess who performed the best? It's the Honor Win and the iQOO 15 series. This three machines achieved only about 35 milliseconds of end-to-end latency. This is actually close to the end-to-end latency of many gaming PCs. This is partly due to the Honor Win achieving a 480 Hz touch sampling rate. The 300 and 360 Hz of the two iQOO 15s are also very high. On the other hand, both have indeed put effort into touch optimization. So, is there anyone whose performance is clearly poor? iPhone. We measured that this year's three iPhones in Peacekeeper Elite link latency reached around 60 milliseconds. They were at the bottom among all the machines tested. The latency performance of other Android machines in Peacekeeper Elite seems fairly similar, all staying within the 40 to 50 milliseconds range. But if you look at the standard deviation, there are a few with relatively unstable latency performance. For example, the Vivo X300 series, the Xiaomi 17 Ultra, and Nubia Z80 Ultra. They all need to be well optimized. I originally thought this should be the touch performance for everyone. The iPhone's latency is indeed far from as good as rumored. That is, until we introduced a new test, an application outside the whitelist, in default battery mode. We wrote a blank app using the same framework to run on Android and iOS, and tested everyone's end-to-end latency again. Wait, this time the results were completely different from those in Peacekeeper Elite. The latency of the 3 iPhones was nearly 20 milliseconds lower than in Peacekeeper Elite. They went from being far behind to being among the best. Why can latency be so much lower? It's primarily that the rendering latency of the Peacekeeper Elite graphics engine is missing. In fact, it's not that the iPhone has high latency, but that the iOS version of Peacekeeper Elite has high latency. Or rather, many iOS games have high latency. Compared with the Android version, there's a major difference in the rendering chain for the iOS versions of these games, which is that they have triple buffering enabled. This leads to additional latency. Actually, Apple's Metal API has triple buffering enabled by default. While it can be changed to double buffering, most developers who aren't chasing low latency just leave it on as recommended by default. So why does Apple recommend triple buffering to developers despite the latency? Let's look at the benefits of triple buffering. As we mentioned before, by queuing an extra frame, it increases the frame reservoir to avoid unstable frame output. Apple's iOS has always been a visual consistency-oriented, animation-driven system. In their philosophy, strict frame rhythm is more important than low latency. Anyway, when we switched to testing with the blank app, the iPhone's latency performance wasn't as poor as in Peacekeeper Elite. So how about other phones? Theoretically, testing our blank app should have no graphics rendering latency, so it should be lower than Peacekeeper Elite. But in fact, the latency for the vast majority of Android machines did not decrease at all. For some, it was even higher. This is because Android's whitelist mechanism is at work. Only when an app on the whitelist is detected will Android enable more sensitive touch sensing. As you can see, because it's not on the whitelist, the touch sampling rate of almost all Android machines decreased, and the touch settings of many Android machines are affected by the battery settings. You only get a better touch experience in performance mode. For example, Xiaomi is like this. After changing the battery setting back to the default balanced, the touch latency of most Xiaomi phones skyrocketed. In our blank app, which excludes graphics rendering, you can also see an advantage of the iPhone. Its touch latency range is very stable. The standard deviation we measured was only 2.x, meaning after so many rounds of testing, there's almost no fluctuation in touch latency. It's all within a very small range. It's among the best in terms of stability among the tested machines. This is also why some rhythm game players prefer using an iPhone or iPad. Because of offsets, rhythm games don't actually chase absolutely low touch latency. As long as your latency isn't too high, it's fine. But iOS touch latency fluctuation is low, and frame output is stable. This is more valued by rhythm game players. And on the other hand, the audio chain of iOS is also better. We had a technical exchange with colleagues from Muse this time. They developed an internal analysis tool that can measure the audio chain latency of both platforms. You can see the iPhone not only has very low audio latency. The iPhone 17 Pro Max has an average latency of only 28 milliseconds. But more importantly, its standard deviation is much smaller than that of Android machines. Only 0-point-something standard deviation. This means the iPhone's audio is extremely stable, and the latency doesn't fluctuate wildly. Audio performance on the Android side is very uneven. However, there are Android machines with good audio. Do you know which is the best Android for audio? The Redmi K90 Pro Max. Although not as stable as the iPhone, its latency is very low. An average latency of 18 milliseconds is head and shoulders above the rest. And you also know that the sound quality of this machine is great. Its audio system has definitely been well tuned. Actually, the overall performance of the Xiaomi series is quite good. The audio latency of the Xiaomi 17 series is also among the best. Including the two iQOO 15s and several Honor flagships, they're all pretty good. But the bad Android machines are really bad. For example, these two machines from Oppo Find X9. Wow, nearly 90 milliseconds of audio latency. Is this really playable for rhythm games? And all these budget-pushing models from OnePlus except for the 15. Not one performs well. Plus, many rhythm games might not even be on Android whitelists. Before a player buys an Android machine, they have no way of knowing whether the audio latency is stable and normal. Now you know why rhythm game players buy iPhones and iPads. We originally wanted to introduce another new latency test: sliding latency. Machines with good click latency might not necessarily have good sliding latency. But measuring sliding latency is very troublesome. If you don't want to count frame by frame, you need to develop a dedicated visual-based algorithm to measure it. We're already working on it. We'll probably be able to use it in our next mega review. At this point, our mega review of mobile gaming performance is coming to an end. How was it? It must have been pretty satisfying to watch. For mobile gamers, among these new machines released in the past year, which is the most suitable for gaming? Let me save you some time. First, on the Apple side, the iPhone 17 Pro Max is definitely worth recommending. It's the iPhone with the best gaming performance and heat dissipation ever. If you have a sufficient budget. On the Android side, among the 8x10 to the power of 5 combining gaming performance and value, I feel the iQOO 15 and Honor Win are the most worthwhile. Of course, you've also seen in today's review that Snapdragon 8x10 to the power of 5 hasn't actually improved much over its predecessor. Next door, Dimensity 9500 was given a chance, but it didn't step up. So for those with less of a budget, I think buying an 8E machine is actually the best deal. Just be careful to avoid some pitfalls, like the standard K90. Of course, this video today only talked about games. We will follow up by using all of these machines to test battery life, cameras, and smoothness. You can look forward to it. Well, if you think this video has enough substance and is useful for you, be sure to like, comment, save, and share. Follow our Geekerwan channel. I'm Yunfei. Happy New Year. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.